What would you do if the man lying on the ground in front of you wasn't just a cop, but your father? Tonight's story isn't just about crime, or poverty, or bad decisions made in dark rooms. It's about how one night of love turned into a lifetime of consequences. It's about a young black couple in South Chicago who believed they could outrun statistics, until reality caught up. It's about abandonment, about a mother who became both shield and sword. It's about a boy who searched for identity in the loudest places he could find it. And it's about 5 seconds, just 5, that changed everything. You'll see how respect on the streets can feel safer than love at home. You'll feel what it's like to grow up where sirens replace lullabies. You'll understand how leadership can look legitimate, even when it's built on fragile ground. And when the blue lights finally flash and the hallway narrows, you'll be standing there with him. Gun raised. Heart racing. Past colliding with present. But here's the real question. Is a man defined by where he comes from, or by what he chooses in the moment that matters most? Stay with me until the end, because this isn't just a story, it's a mirror. And somewhere in it, you might find yourself. If you believe stories can change perspectives, hit the like button and subscribe, because here, we don't just retell songs. We transform them into lessons you'll never forget. He used to say that in neighborhoods like theirs, love didn't knock politely at the door. It slipped in through cracked windows, between sirens and shouting, between broken streetlights and the smell of fried food from the corner store that never really closed. They met in a part of South Chicago where opportunity felt like a rumor and survival was the daily headline. She worked double shifts at a diner off 79th Street, tired but proud, and he drifted between short-term construction gigs and long afternoons leaning against brick walls, talking big dreams with friends who secretly felt small. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real, built on laughter in cramped apartments, shared bus rides, and whispered promises under a flickering hallway light. When you grow up counting coins before counting blessings, affection becomes currency, and they spent it freely. He called her Queen, even when neither of them had a throne to sit on. And in that fragile reality, love felt like rebellion against statistics that said they wouldn't make it. That night, the night that would echo for decades, wasn't glamorous or cinematic. It was messy, human, and full of borrowed hope. They were at a friend's small birthday gathering, music playing from an old Bluetooth speaker, bass vibrating through cracked plaster walls. Outside, police lights painted the night red and blue like a warning that never really left. Inside, they danced too close, laughed too loud, trying to forget that rent was overdue and the heater barely worked. You see, sometimes when life feels heavy, people cling tighter to each other just to breathe. She looked at him like he was more than his circumstances, and that kind of gaze can make a man feel invincible, even when he isn't. He promised her things he hadn't yet learned how to build. And in that warmth, choices were made that neither of them fully understood the weight of. The truth is, relationships formed in hard places carry both passion and pressure. When your environment teaches you that tomorrow isn't guaranteed, everything feels urgent: love, anger, loyalty, fear. He had grown up without much guidance, raised mostly by a grandmother who did her best but couldn't shield him from the streets. She had watched her own mother struggle, working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, always saying, "Baby, don't let this place decide who you are." But it's hard not to absorb what surrounds you. The block had stories: boys who made fast money and disappeared, girls who raised siblings before raising themselves. Still, they believed they were different. Everybody thinks they're the exception, until life tests that theory. In those early months, their love felt like a quiet protest against the noise of helicopters overhead and the tension that lived in the air. They'd sit on the building steps sharing cheap takeout, talking about moving somewhere safer. Maybe Atlanta, maybe Houston, somewhere with more space and fewer memorial murals on brick walls. He talked about starting his own business one day, something legit, something clean. She talked about going back to school, maybe nursing, maybe social work, because she wanted to help girls who grew up like she did. If you had walked by, you might have thought they were just another young couple dreaming out loud. And maybe they were. But dreams spoken in survival mode often carry cracks you can't see at first glance. There were warning signs, of course, subtle, easy to ignore. He sometimes disappeared for hours without explanation, brushed off questions with a shrug and a "don't worry about it." She noticed the tension in his jaw when certain names were mentioned. Certain cars drove by slowly. The streets have a way of pulling at young men who crave respect more than rest. Still, he wasn't fully lost. Not yet. He held her hand like it grounded him. And she believed, with that fierce kind of faith only young love carries, that she could anchor him to something better. That belief would soon be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. On that particular night, after the party thinned out and the music faded, they walked back to her apartment under a sky that looked heavier than usual. The city hummed in the background, distant traffic, a dog barking, a train rattling far off. They talked about nothing and everything, about escaping someday, about proving people wrong. And in that small bedroom with peeling paint and a window that didn't fully close, they reached for comfort the only way they knew how. It wasn't reckless in their minds, it was intimate, emotional, almost defiant. But sometimes life changes quietly, without dramatic music or flashing signs. Sometimes it shifts in a single decision made between hope and fear. Days passed, then weeks, and she began to notice small changes in her body. Fatigue that wasn't just from work, nausea that wasn't from stress. She tried to ignore it at first, telling herself it was nothing, that life couldn't possibly add another complication. But deep down, something whispered that the night they thought was just another chapter had actually begun a whole new story. And when she finally decided to tell him, she had no idea that his reaction would reveal more about his character than any promise ever had. He used to joke that in their part of South Chicago, love didn't show up with roses, it showed up with a bus pass, a cracked phone screen, and a promise whispered fast before the next siren cut the air. They were young, black, and trying to build something tender in a place that taught you to stay tough, because softness could get you swallowed whole. Her building had a front door that never latched right, and the hallway light flickered like it was tired of trying, same as everyone inside. On the corner, the liquor store glowed bright at midnight, while the school down the street looked like it had been waiting for repairs since forever. Some blocks had fresh murals of smiling faces with dates underneath, memorials painted so often they started to look like part of the architecture. He'd look at those walls and say, "We gotta outlive the neighborhood," like survival was a goal you could chase like a paycheck. And she'd laugh, but it was the kind of laugh that covered fear, because in their world, fear didn't announce itself, it lived quietly in routines. She worked a diner shift that started before sunrise, hair tied back, feet aching, pouring coffee for folks who called her sweetheart like it was kindness. Then she'd take another job some evenings, retail, cleaning, anything, because rent didn't care about dreams, and bills didn't accept excuses. He bounced between day labor construction, warehouse temp work, and little hustles he never described in full, always vague, always quick to change the subject. Not because he enjoyed lying, but because honesty felt dangerous when everybody was always watching, always judging, always ready to label you a statistic. He hated how the world looked at him like he was guilty before he spoke, like his hoodie was a confession and his skin was evidence. She hated it too, but she carried it differently, more quietly, like a weight she refused to drop because she had places to be and shifts to survive. And somehow, in that pressure cooker, they found each other, two people trying to breathe in a room that kept getting smaller. They met at a friend's cookout in a tiny backyard, where the music was loud enough to almost drown out the helicopters passing overhead. Aunties played spades at a folding table, kids ran barefoot through dry grass, and older men stood near the fence talking politics like it was personal war. When he first made her laugh, it wasn't with a smooth line, it was with a dumb joke about how the grill smoke seasoned the whole block. She laughed so hard she bent forward, and in that second he saw something rare, joy that didn't ask permission from the environment. He asked for her number like a man asking for hope, not romance, and she gave it like she was tired of being strong alone. They started dating in the kind of way poor neighborhoods understand, walking together, sharing food, splitting rides, making said, "I got you," mean something practical. And every time they held hands, it felt like they were telling the city, "Not today, you don't get to take this from us." Still, the tension wasn't just outside, it seeped in through everyday moments like cold air through a broken window frame. Sometimes they'd be laughing on her couch and suddenly, pop in the distance, both of them would freeze, listening, counting, waiting for the silence to return. He had friends who moved different now, friends who stopped talking about jobs and started talking about respect, the kind that comes with danger attached. She noticed how he'd glance over his shoulder when a car slowed down, how his voice changed when police cruisers rolled by too slowly. And she noticed the way adults around them spoke in coded language, "Be careful, stay out the way, don't be seen too much." People outside that world call it paranoia, but inside it's just pattern recognition, because you learn early that attention can be a threat. So their love grew inside a cage of caution, and they painted the bars with jokes, dreams, and late-night plans. That night, the night the song would eventually be born from, didn't feel like a tragedy at first. It felt like a rare break from stress. They went to a small birthday kickback in an apartment where the speakers buzzed, the floor shook with bass, and everybody acted like tomorrow was guaranteed. There was cheap soda, cheap liquor, and the kind of laughter that comes when people are trying to forget they're one bad month away from losing everything. Outside, squad lights flashed at the end of the street like a reminder that peace in their neighborhood was temporary, rented by the minute. Inside, he kept pulling her close like he was trying to protect her from the whole world with just his arms and a smile. She looked at him like he was more than his circumstances, and that kind of look can make a man feel like he could outrun fate. And when you feel like the world is against you, you start chasing comfort like it's a lifeline. Fast, intense, and a little reckless. On the walk back, they passed a boarded-up store, a bus stop with a broken bench, and a candle memorial half melted into the sidewalk. She squeezed his hand, and for a second the city softened, like the street noise lowered its voice out of respect for what they were trying to build. They talked about leaving someday, Atlanta maybe, Houston maybe, anywhere with space, anywhere that didn't treat young black love like a temporary mistake. He promised, "I'm gonna get us out," and she wanted to believe him so badly she almost didn't hear the doubt in his tone. Back in her room, with peeling paint and a window that didn't lock right, they chose intimacy as escape, warmth as rebellion, love as proof. No dramatic soundtrack, no warning label, just two young people trying to feel safe in a world that rarely offered a void. And the next morning, life kept moving, but something unseen had already shifted, quietly, like a door closing in slow motion. Weeks later, the signs started small, extra tired, nausea that didn't match her routine, moods that made her pause mid-sentence like her body was speaking first. She told herself it was stress, it was work, it was everything. Anything except what her gut already suspected, because the truth felt too heavy to carry alone. In places like hers, a pregnancy isn't just a life event, it's a crossroads, and everybody has an opinion before you even find your footing. She pictured the bills, the safety, the way people judged young black mothers like they were the reason the world was broken, not the ones surviving it. She held a test in her hand one night and stared at it like it was a verdict, not a piece of plastic, her heart pounding like a warning drum. And the scariest part wasn't the baby, it was the question she couldn't shake. What happens when she tells him? Because she had seen enough to know this. Some men say, "I love you," until love costs them something, and then they disappear. When she finally told him, she didn't do it in some dramatic movie moment. No spotlight, no violin, no perfect timing. It was a regular night with an irregular fear, the kind of fear that makes your throat feel tight before you even speak. She waited until the apartment got quiet, until the TV noise softened, until his phone stopped buzzing for 5 straight minutes. Then she sat him down at the small kitchen table that wobbled if you leaned too hard, hands folded like she was praying for courage. Her voice came out gentle but shaky, "I'm pregnant," and the room seemed to hold its breath with her. For a second, he stared like he didn't hear, like the words bounced off him and fell onto the floor between them. And when he finally blinked, his face didn't light up, his face went blank, like the world had just handed him a bill he refused to pay. At first he didn't yell, which almost made it worse, because silence can be crueler than anger when you're hoping for love. He stood up, paced the room, ran his hands over his head, and muttered things that sounded like excuses rehearsing themselves. He kept saying, "Nah, you sure?" Like denial could reverse biology, like disbelief could erase consequence. She tried to explain how she felt sick, how she took the test twice, how she wasn't playing with him, how she was scared too. But his eyes weren't on her anymore. His eyes were on the ceiling, on the window, on anywhere that wasn't responsibility. And you could see it, that mental math some people do. What do I lose if I stay? That's a heartbreaking moment, when you realize someone is calculating your value instead of holding your hand. Then he did the thing that splits a woman's life into before and after. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a stack of crumpled bills like it was nothing, and pushed it toward her across the table. "Here," he said, voice cold, casual, too casual, "you know what to do with that." He didn't say the word, not directly, because some people like their cruelty to stay clean on paper. But she understood, because pain doesn't need subtitles. It translates instantly in any language. Her stomach turned, not from pregnancy this time, but from the insult, the way he made her motherhood sound like a mistake to erase. And the wild part. He looked almost relieved after he said it, like he'd just freed himself from the future. She didn't scream right away, because shock is quiet at first, like the soul trying to process betrayal without breaking. She stared at that money, and it felt dirty, like it had been dragged through everything ugly the world already threw at her. She asked him, softly, "So that's it?" And her voice sounded smaller than she wanted it to. He shrugged, actually shrugged, like this was a minor inconvenience, like her whole life was a schedule conflict. He said things like, "I'm not ready, I can't do this, you'll be fine," as if fine was a real plan. She reminded him of the promises, the talks about leaving, the dreams they shared like bread when they were hungry for hope. And he answered with a sentence that punches a hole in your chest, "That was just talk." He left that night, and he didn't leave like someone torn. He left like someone escaping. Door shutting, footsteps down the hallway, no hug, no "call me," no lingering glance back. Just gone, swallowed by the same streets that raised him, the same streets that made disappearing look normal. She stood there with her hand on her belly like she was trying to protect a life that didn't even have a name yet. And outside, the neighborhood kept being itself. Cars passing, music bumping, someone arguing, sirens doing their nightly routine. That's the thing about hard places. The world doesn't pause for your heartbreak, it just plays louder over it. She felt alone in a city full of people, which is a special kind of loneliness that doesn't even let you cry properly. The next day, she tried calling, and the calls went straight to voicemail like rejection dressed up as technology. She texted him, short messages at first, then longer ones, then desperate ones she deleted before sending because pride still lived in her. She checked social media and saw he was active, posting jokes, liking pictures, living like his future wasn't sitting in her stomach. And she realized something painful. Some men can detach from consequences the way they detach from emotions, like flipping a switch. She went to work anyway, because rent doesn't care that you got abandoned, and she smiled at customers because tips don't wait for tears. But in the bathroom, she'd press her forehead against the stall door and breathe through panic like it was a shift too. That's when the fear got practical. Not, will he come back, but, how do I survive if he never does? She didn't tell everybody, not right away, because in her neighborhood news traveled faster than ambulances. And people had opinions like they were handing out flyers, some sympathetic, some judgmental, most ignorant of how complicated survival is. She told one friend first, a girl she'd grown up with, who didn't gasp or lecture. She just said, "Okay, we got you." Then another friend, then an older neighbor who had seen too much life and knew when to step in without being asked. Soon, she had this small circle of people, imperfect people, tired people, working people, who understood one simple truth: she couldn't do it alone. They helped her find a clinic for checkups, reminded her to eat, offered rides when buses felt unsafe late at night. And every small act of help felt like someone restitching her dignity after it got ripped open at that kitchen table. Still, the fear didn't disappear, because support doesn't change the zip code. She lived in a part of the city where gunshots were sometimes closer than the ice cream truck, where kids learned to duck before they learned to drive. She'd look out her window and see teenagers posted up, older guys watching corners, patrol cars rolling through like they expected trouble, because they did. And she'd touch her belly and think, how do I raise a child here? How do I keep him soft enough to love, but strong enough to survive? She knew the stats people talk about on TV, the way society treats black boys like threats before they're even tall enough to reach the top shelf. And that knowledge wasn't academic for her, it was personal, heavy, a shadow that followed her from the bus stop to her front door. So even with friends around, she lay awake at night, listening to the city breathe danger, and praying her baby wouldn't inherit it. Then the doctor said the words that made her blood run cold: high-risk pregnancy. Not a casual warning, not a "take it easy," but a serious look and a careful tone that told her this wasn't just hard, it could be deadly. She sat in that cold clinic room, paper sheet crinkling beneath her, and felt tears come without permission. Because it's one thing to be abandoned, it's another thing to realize you might not even survive the road ahead. Her friends stepped up even more, bringing groceries, helping her rest, checking in like clockwork, making sure she didn't disappear into depression. And in the middle of all that fear, she began to feel something else grow too. Stubborn faith, the kind you don't post online, the kind you live quietly. She started praying in her own messy way, whispering, "God, please, if you give me this child, give me the strength to be both mother and father." No fairy tale, no rescue, no sudden apology from the man who left. Just a woman standing in the storm, learning how to stay upright. And even though she didn't say it out loud yet, Her heart was already preparing for the hardest truth. This baby might grow up asking questions. Questions like, "Where's my dad?" And "Why didn't he want me?" And "Was it my fault?" She didn't have answers, only love, and love is powerful, but it doesn't stop bullets, it doesn't stop streets, it doesn't stop fate from circling. So she promised herself she would do everything she could, even if everything was still not enough in a place like that. She promised she'd fight, she'd work, she'd pray, she'd protect, she'd teach, she'd sacrifice, whatever it took. And that promise, quiet, trembling, real, was the first brick in the foundation of a story that would one day end with a gun in a shaking hand. The day her son was born didn't come wrapped in peace. It came with sirens in the distance and fear sitting beside her hospital bed like an unwelcome visitor. Labor was complicated, the doctors moved quickly, and at one point she thought she might not make it, gripping the sheets like she was holding on to life itself. But when she finally heard that first cry, sharp and defiant, something shifted inside her, like God had pressed restart on her courage. She looked at that tiny face and whispered, "You're here for a reason," even though the world outside didn't look ready for him. The nurses smiled, but she noticed the quiet glances. Young black mother, no father present, high-risk case, boxes people checked without knowing her story. She didn't argue, she just held her baby closer, already understanding that she would have to be twice as strong in a world that measured him twice as harshly. And in that sterile hospital room, she made a silent vow. Her son would not become a headline or a statistic if she had anything to say about it. Bringing him home meant stepping back into a neighborhood that didn't pause just because a miracle had happened. The same cracked sidewalks, the same graffiti, the same helicopters slicing through the sky at night like reminders that danger had a schedule. She carried him up 3 flights of stairs, diaper bag on one shoulder, exhaustion on the other, heart determined in between. Some neighbors congratulated her warmly. Others shook their heads in that "single mother again" kind of way that stings more than insults. But she didn't waste energy defending herself. Survival had already taught her how to ignore background noise. She arranged his small crib in the corner of her room, near the window she wished was safer, whispering prayers over him before sleep. And every night, she listened to the city breathe outside, wondering how to build peace inside 4 fragile walls. Raising a black boy in that part of the city meant preparing for realities other mothers didn't always have to think about so soon. Before he could walk, she was already thinking about how to teach him to move carefully, how to respect authority without losing his dignity. Before he could talk, she imagined the conversation she would one day have about traffic stops and keeping his hands visible. Some might call it paranoia, but in her world, it was preparation, the kind that keeps sons alive. She worked overtime shifts, sometimes coming home so tired she had to sit in the stairwell for a minute just to gather strength. Still, she never missed reading to him at night, even if it was just 1 page, even if her eyes closed halfway through. Because she believed literacy was armor, discipline was protection, and love was the one thing the streets couldn't easily steal. Money was tight, tighter than she admitted, but pride kept her creative. She budgeted down to the last dollar, learned how to stretch groceries, took hand-me-down clothes and made them look brand new. Friends helped when they could, watching him during shifts, bringing over leftovers, sharing advice that sounded more like battle strategy than parenting tips. "Keep him busy," one older neighbor said. "Idle hands learn the wrong lessons." So she signed him up for community programs, church groups, after-school clubs, anything to keep his feet moving in safe directions. But even then, she knew something most people don't say out loud. You can guide a child, but you can't control the gravity of the environment. And gravity in that neighborhood pulled hard, especially on boys growing up without fathers. As he got older, she noticed how people treated him differently, even as a toddler. Store clerks watched him a little longer, security guards followed a little closer, teachers sometimes assumed he'd be trouble before he even spoke. She saw it, the subtle bias, the unspoken suspicion, and it made her protective in a way that bordered on fierce. She corrected him gently but firmly, teaching him manners like they were shields. "Yes, ma'am. No, sir. Hands out your pockets." She told him, "You are not what this neighborhood expects you to be," even when doubt tried to creep into her own voice. At night, when he slept, she'd sit beside him and think about the statistics she once heard: incarceration rates, dropout rates, poverty cycles. And instead of letting those numbers define him, she used them as motivation, whispering, "You will break this pattern." There were beautiful moments too, because struggle doesn't erase joy, it just makes it more deliberate. She cheered louder than anyone at his kindergarten recital. even when he forgot his lines and just waved at her from stage. She celebrated report cards like they were diplomas, hugged him tight when he scraped his knees, kissed his forehead before every first day of school. Sometimes they'd sit on the building steps sharing popsicles in the summer, laughing like the world outside didn't exist. Those were the moments she lived for, small, ordinary, sacred, proof that love could bloom even in cracked concrete. But in the distance, the older boys on the corner stood watching, living examples of roads she prayed he'd never take. And she couldn't ignore the truth that one day, her son would start noticing them too. As he grew taller, stronger, more aware, the question started, subtle at first. "Why don't I have a dad like Marcus?" he once asked, voice innocent but curious. She paused, heart tightening, and said carefully, "Because sometimes adults make choices they don't understand." She didn't want to poison his heart with bitterness, even though hers had scars that never fully healed. She told him he was wanted, loved, chosen by God, even if not chosen by the man who helped create him. But she also knew something else. Identity gaps don't just disappear because you fill them with encouragement. And deep down, she sensed that one day, that missing piece would turn into a hunger she might not be able to satisfy alone. So she kept fighting, quietly, consistently, stubbornly, against forces bigger than her paycheck and louder than her prayers. She believed structure mattered, that discipline could compete with temptation, that guidance could outrun influence. But the streets were patient, and they don't rush their recruitment. They wait until a boy starts craving respect more than advice. She didn't know exactly when the shift would happen, when curiosity would turn into rebellion. She just knew that the older he got, the less she could physically shield him from the world outside. And as he approached his teenage years, something in his eyes began to change. Less softness, more storm. And that storm was about to test everything she had built. By the time he turned 13, the softness she once kissed goodnight had started to harden around the edges. It didn't happen overnight. Rebellion rarely does. It creeps in quietly, like rust on something that used to shine. He began answering her with shorter sentences, rolling his eyes in ways that felt sharper than words. Teachers called more often, not about missing homework at first, but about attitude, about disruption, about potential if he would just focus. That word potential became a ghost in their house, always mentioned, never fully realized. He walked through hallways at school with his shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, like he was bracing for impact even when no one was pushing him. And somewhere between middle school lockers and neighborhood corners, he started craving something his home couldn't fully provide, visible respect. At school, he didn't feel like a student. He felt watched. Security guards lingered a little too close when he laughed too loud. Teachers assumed sarcasm when he asked questions with too much confidence. One suspension came after a hallway argument that escalated faster than it should have, both boys shouting, both feeling misunderstood. He said later, "They already think I'm the problem, so what difference does it make?" And that sentence scared her more than any report card. Because when a young man starts believing the label before the world even finishes writing it, the fight changes. He wasn't stupid, he was frustrated, confused, wounded in ways he didn't yet know how to explain. And frustration without guidance can turn into fuel for the wrong fire. At home, their conversations became shorter, heavier. She'd ask about homework, he'd shrug. She'd ask about friends, he'd say, "You don't know them." She tried grounding him, setting rules, enforcing curfews, but discipline without understanding felt like walls closing in on him. He started spending more time outside, not necessarily doing anything illegal at first, just standing on the block, observing. The older boys didn't lecture him, didn't question him, didn't remind him of his potential. They nodded at him, called him young king, let him stand beside them like he belonged. And sometimes, belonging feels more powerful than safety. He began dressing differently, subtle changes at first. New sneakers that cost more than he could explain, a chain that wasn't expensive but symbolized alignment with something bigger than himself. He practiced a new walk, slower, deliberate, mimicking the men he saw commanding attention on the corner. She noticed, of course. Mothers notice before anyone else does. She'd say, "Watch who you stand next to," and he'd reply, "It's just people from around here." But she understood the difference between around here and leading here, and she knew influence travels fast. Still, she couldn't follow him everywhere, and that reality ate at her in quiet moments. There were fights, not violent, but loud enough to shake the apartment walls. He accused her of not understanding what it was like to be him, to walk through spaces where suspicion followed his shadow. She told him she did understand, maybe not as a boy, but as someone who survived the same concrete and sirens. He brought up his father once, in anger, asking why the man never stayed, why he never tried. She swallowed her pain and answered carefully, refusing to let bitterness poison her son's identity. But the question lingered between them like unfinished business, like a missing chapter he was trying to write on his own. And when identity feels incomplete, young men sometimes search for it in the loudest places possible. One afternoon, she got a call from the principal, another suspension. This time it wasn't just words, it was a physical confrontation after someone disrespected him publicly. He said he couldn't let it slide, couldn't look weak, couldn't let anyone think he was soft. And that word soft had become dangerous in his vocabulary, because in his environment softness invited challenge. She tried explaining that strength isn't about volume, that power isn't about fear, but those lessons compete with real-time peer pressure. He looked at her like she was speaking a language that didn't apply outside their front door. And that disconnect, between home wisdom and street logic, was widening by the day. By 16, he had mastered the art of selective listening. He'd nod when she spoke about college, about trade programs, about building something legitimate. But his eyes wandered toward the window, toward the corner, toward the world that seemed to reward dominance faster than patience. He started coming home later, sometimes smelling like smoke, sometimes quiet in ways that felt calculated. Not broken yet, not gone, but drifting like a boat untied from its dock. She prayed harder, watched closer, loved louder, but love doesn't erase influence, it competes with it. And one evening, when he came home with a look in his eyes she had never seen before, colder, resolved, she realized the streets were no longer just watching him, they were welcoming him. Nobody wakes up one morning and says, "Today I become a criminal." That's not how it works, especially not in neighborhoods where illegal opportunity often looks more accessible than legal success. For him, it started small, almost invisible, the way most dangerous roads do. An older guy on the block asked him to hold something real quick, nothing dramatic, just a favor dressed up as trust. Then it was delivering a message, watching a corner for a few minutes, running errands that paid more in 1 hour than a legal job paid in a day. He told himself it wasn't serious, just temporary, just helping out people who showed him respect when school only showed him suspicion. And the first time someone handed him cash for doing almost nothing, he felt something shift, not guilt, but validation. That's the hook people don't talk about enough, validation. In environments where young black men are constantly told what they can't be, the streets tell them exactly what they are, needed. Needed to watch, needed to move, needed to enforce, needed to represent. It feels like belonging, and belonging is addictive when you felt invisible or misunderstood. He liked how older guys listened when he spoke, how they called him by name instead of by discipline record. He liked that nobody questioned his tone, nobody corrected his posture, nobody reminded him of his potential. Potential feels abstract, cash in hand feels real. At first, it wasn't violence, it was logistics. Carrying packages he didn't open, standing lookout while others handled transactions, memorizing which cars were safe and which weren't. He learned the rhythm of the block, who worked nights, when patrol units rotated, how long sirens usually took to respond. Not because he wanted to break the law for thrill, but because survival in that ecosystem required awareness. The older guys framed it like business: supply, demand, territory, structure. They spoke in coded language, careful with words, strategic with movements. And for the first time, he felt like he was studying something practical, something that applied directly to his reality. Money started coming in more consistently. Not millions, not movie-style stacks, but enough to buy better sneakers, help with groceries, pay small bills quietly. He even handed his mother some cash once, saying it was from extra shifts, and she wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. Deep down, she knew the math didn't add up, but poverty trains people to accept relief without interrogation. He justified it by telling himself he was easing her burden, doing what his absent father never did. In his mind, he wasn't becoming the villain, he was becoming the provider. That's the dangerous illusion, when wrong choices were the mask of responsibility. As weeks turned into months, the tasks grew heavier. Now it wasn't just watching, it was managing small crews of younger teens who looked at him the way he once looked at older men. He learned how territory worked, how disputes started, how ego could escalate faster than logic. He wasn't reckless, he was observant, calculating, careful with words and posture. That's another truth people misunderstand. Not every street leader is chaotic. Some are strategic, disciplined, even patient. He built a reputation not for wildness, but for composure, for knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. And in that environment, composure equals authority. His mother noticed the shift before she had proof. The new clothes came faster, the confidence felt sharper, the way he carried himself seemed heavier. She'd ask questions carefully, not accusing, but probing, hoping for honesty. He'd answer halfway, never fully lying, never fully confessing. And she saw the pattern she once feared, respect from the streets competing with guidance from home. She reminded him that quick money often carries long consequences, but he'd reply, "I'm just moving smart." Smart can mean different things depending on the system you're operating in. The first time he witnessed real violence up close, it wasn't cinematic. No dramatic speeches, no slow motion, just tension, raised voices, and fear disguised as dominance. He realized then that this wasn't just about cash. It was about power, about reputation, about survival inside a hierarchy. And once you understand hierarchy, you start climbing, because staying low feels dangerous too. He told himself he'd never go too far, never cross certain lines, never lose control. But every phase had its next phase waiting, and each one required a little more commitment than the last. And soon, the boy who once stood on the corner observing would no longer be standing behind anyone. By 19, he wasn't the kid running errands anymore. He was the one giving instructions. Not loud, not reckless, not the stereotype people expect, but calculated, composed, almost corporate in the way he moved. He learned quickly that leadership in that world wasn't about who shouted the most. It was about who stayed calm when others panicked. When disputes broke out between smaller crews, he positioned himself as mediator first, enforcer second, and that earned him something more valuable than money: influence. Influence spreads quietly, like reputation carried through whispers on street corners and text messages sent in code. Older guys started stepping back, either aging out or locked away, and a vacuum formed, and he filled it without announcing it. And in neighborhoods where structure often collapses, anyone who brings order becomes powerful. He built layers. That's what smart operators do. He didn't handle everything directly. He assigned roles, delegated tasks, created buffers between himself and risk. Younger boys watched corners, mid-level runners handled distribution, and he oversaw movement without always being physically present. It looked chaotic from the outside, but inside it followed a system. Territory mapped mentally, shifts staggered, communication controlled. He studied patterns, which nights were busiest, which blocks drew attention, which rival tensions needed cooling before they exploded. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was managing. And management, in that world, is a form of authority that feels almost legitimate if you squint at it long enough. Money multiplied, not overnight, but steadily. Better clothes became normal, not special. He upgraded apartments, moved his mother into a slightly safer building under the excuse of new job opportunities. She accepted the move, grateful, but her instincts whispered that blessings built too fast often carry cracks. He bought groceries without checking price tags, paid bills before they were due, even funded small repairs for neighbors. To the block, he became the one who looks out. And when people depend on you financially, loyalty grows roots, even if those roots are planted in unstable soil. But power reshapes perception. The more he climbed, the less he felt like the boy who once got suspended for hallway arguments. He spoke slower now, measured, eyes scanning constantly, not paranoid, just aware. He knew rival groups were watching, testing boundaries, waiting for missteps. He knew law enforcement had files, had names, had patterns mapped on corkboards somewhere downtown. So he adjusted, changed routes, rotated phones, limited exposure. And each precaution made him feel smarter, sharper, untouchable. There were phases to everything. First phase, curiosity. Second phase, participation. Third phase, control. He was now in the fourth phase, consolidation. He wasn't chasing fast thrills. He was building dominance, securing territory, maintaining balance between fear and respect. And balance in that ecosystem is fragile. One wrong move, one wrong alliance, and everything collapses. His mother noticed the difference in his presence. He didn't argue anymore, he dismissed. Didn't shout, he concluded. There was a calm in him that didn't feel peaceful, it felt strategic. She tried talking about legitimate business ventures, trade programs, using his leadership skills somewhere safer. He'd listen politely, even smile, but his eyes said, "You don't understand the scale of what I've built." And she realized something terrifying. Her son no longer saw himself as surviving the streets, he saw himself owning them. The block respected him. Rivals negotiated instead of escalating immediately. Younger kids admired him the way he once admired older figures. And that admiration fed something deep, the missing piece left by his father's absence. He had become what he once searched for: authority, presence, recognition. But authority built on fragile ground demands constant defense. And somewhere across the city, quiet conversations were happening. Conversations that would soon bring blue lights back into his life in a way he couldn't manage, delegate, or predict. Operations like that don't happen by accident. They build quietly over months: surveillance, reports, confidential tips, patterns stitched together like a puzzle nobody sees being assembled. Downtown, in rooms far from the block, officers reviewed maps with colored markers tracing territory lines and recurring names. One of those names had started appearing more often lately: calm, strategic, low exposure, high influence. The detectives called it organizational growth. He called it smart movement. But both sides were studying the same chessboard from opposite ends. The night it went down felt heavier than usual, even before the first cruiser rolled in. The air was thick, humid, almost electric, like the city knew something was about to break. He had just finished a meeting with 2 mid-level runners, adjusting routes after rumors of increased patrol presence. He didn't look nervous, he rarely did, but he felt something subtle in his chest, a tightness he brushed off as fatigue. Across town, officers were suiting up, vests secured, radios checked, warrants signed and sealed. Among them was a veteran officer assigned to tactical entry, a man who had seen too many young faces on the wrong side of a barrel. Neither of them knew how close their timelines had been running in parallel for years. When the first sirens pierced the night, chaos didn't explode immediately, it hesitated. Then lights flooded the block, red and blue bouncing off brick walls and window glass. Doors slammed, voices shouted commands, boots hit pavement in synchronized urgency. Younger crew members scattered instinctively, some running, some freezing, some dropping whatever they were holding. He didn't run right away. Leaders rarely do. He scanned exits, calculated angles, processed movement like he had trained himself to do. But this wasn't a corner dispute, this was coordinated force. Inside one of the targeted buildings, officers cleared rooms methodically. Clear left. Clear right. Move. The veteran officer moved with discipline, weapon steady but eyes alert, trained to expect resistance but hoping not to use it. He didn't see Kingpin when he thought about these operations. He saw sons, products of systems larger than individual mistakes. Still, duty doesn't bend for sympathy. He entered the final hallway, hearing footsteps approaching from the opposite side. And in that narrow corridor, under flickering fluorescent light, 2 paths that began decades earlier were about to collide. He stepped into view first, heavier presence, controlled posture, weapon drawn but not firing. The officer turned the corner at the same second, reflexes sharpened by years of repetition. For a split moment, neither moved. Recognition didn't happen, not yet, just assessment. Target acquired. Threat evaluated. Distance measured. The officer shouted commands, voice firm but not frantic. And he responded not with panic, but with pride. Around them, the noise swelled, radios crackling, boots running, someone yelling from another room. But in that hallway, it felt almost quiet, like the world narrowed to 2 men facing the consequences of entirely different life choices. The officer saw discipline in the young man's stance, not wildness, not chaos, and that realization hit harder than expected. The young man saw authority, legitimacy, power sanctioned by law, the very structure he had spent years maneuvering around. Both held weapons. Both felt the weight of irreversible decisions pressing in. And somewhere outside, running through barricades and screaming his name, was a woman who recognized something neither of them yet understood. She saw the lights from blocks away and her heart sank before her mind could catch up. Mothers develop instincts that outrun sirens. She pushed past officers, neighbors, caution tape, shouting his childhood nickname into the night like it could rewind time. She reached the building entrance just as more tactical units moved in, and fear wrapped around her like cold metal. Because something in her spirit told her this wasn't just another raid. This was alignment, destiny forcing two unfinished stories into the same room. And upstairs, in that hallway, the next 5 seconds were about to define everything. Time doesn't slow down in moments like that, it fractures. The hallway felt narrow, air heavy, lights buzzing like they were aware of the decision hanging between two trigger fingers. The officer kept his voice steady, repeating commands the way training demands, but inside, something unfamiliar stirred, a flicker of recognition he couldn't explain. The young man stood firm, weapon raised but not fired, jaw tight, pride battling instinct. Boots echoed behind them, backup moving into position, tension stacking layer upon layer. And then, from the stairwell, cutting through every radio call and shouted order, came a voice cracked by terror. "Please, don't shoot. That's my son." She burst into the hallway before anyone could stop her, tears already falling, hands raised like surrendering to fate itself. Her eyes moved from the officer on the ground, wounded, bleeding from a shoulder graze during the entry, to the young man standing over him. Then she screamed the sentence that split the universe open, "That man! That's your father!" Silence didn't fall, it shattered. The officer's eyes widened, confusion crashing into memory. The young man's grip tightened involuntarily, then loosened just as fast. And in that instant, identity rewrote itself in real time. The officer looked at the woman fully for the first time. Years had passed, but recognition doesn't need perfection, it needs truth. He saw the same eyes from decades ago, the same strength, the same quiet resilience. And the young man, the leader, the strategist, the one who thought he owned the block, suddenly felt something far more destabilizing than fear. He felt context. He felt history slamming into his present like a door kicked open. The enemy in front of him wasn't random. It was blood. His mother stepped between them, trembling, not brave because she wasn't afraid, but brave because fear had no other option. "He left," she said through tears, voice breaking but steady enough to carry truth. "He left before you were born, but you are not him." The officer tried to speak, pain cutting through his words, but guilt spoke louder than injury ever could. He recognized the timeline instantly, the night, the abandonment, the silence that followed. He had built a career enforcing law, but never returned to face the life he helped create. And now that life stood above him, armed and justified. The young man's hand trembled. Not weakness, conflict. He had rehearsed power his entire adult life, mastered control, learned never to hesitate. But this wasn't a rival corner, wasn't territory negotiation, wasn't dominance strategy. This was legacy. He saw his mother's exhaustion in flashes, the double shifts, the quiet tears, the discipline wrapped in love. He saw himself as a child asking about a father who never showed. And suddenly the weapon felt heavier than it ever had before. There are moments in life where destiny pauses, not for minutes, not for speeches, but for seconds. 5 seconds, maybe less, where the noise fades and the soul speaks louder than ego. His breathing slowed. He looked at the officer, not as authority, not as enemy, but as flawed humanity. He heard his mother's voice again, softer now, "You don't have to be what hurt us." And something ancient stirred inside him, not street logic, not pride, but conscience. The kind that doesn't shout, it whispers. The officer closed his eyes briefly, not in surrender, but in acceptance, ready for consequence. But the young man exhaled, long and heavy, and lowered the weapon inch by inch. "I won't," he said quietly. "Not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to become you." The hallway didn't explode, it released. Officers rushed in, disarming carefully, medics pressing gauze against the officer's wound. And his mother collapsed to her knees, crying not out of defeat, but out of relief that mercy had won by 5 seconds. Later, when the noise settled and the flashing lights dimmed, reality returned, arrest, charges, legal consequences waiting. Mercy doesn't erase accountability. But something else had shifted permanently. The young man had proven something deeper than dominance. He had proven he could break a cycle in the exact moment it tried to define him. And the officer, lying on that stretcher, understood that absence has consequences that echo across decades. The streets had raised one version of him. But in 5 seconds of reflection, something greater had spoken, something merciful, something inherited from a mother who never gave up. Now let me ask you something honestly. If you were standing in that hallway, holding that weight in your hands, knowing the man in front of you helped shape your pain, would you have lowered the weapon? Because this story wasn't really about crime. It wasn't just about poverty, or abandonment, or bad choices made in hard neighborhoods. It was about cycles. Cycles of absence. Cycles of anger. Cycles that repeat themselves until someone decides, in a single moment, to break them. That young man grew up surrounded by statistics that predicted his fall. He climbed the streets, built power, commanded respect. But in 5 seconds of reflection, he proved something bigger than dominance. He proved that mercy can be stronger than pride. And here's the part one wants you to think about. How many lives are shaped by decisions made in seconds? How many fathers never come back? How many sons grow up searching for identity in places that only offer power, not peace? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think he made the right choice? Would you have done the same? And what song should we transform into a powerful story next? If you felt something while listening to this, don't just scroll away. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us. Because here, we don't just tell stories based on songs. We uncover the truth hidden between the lyrics.